Billionaire was at a Christmas party, until a call said his ex was at the hospital having his baby. Before we begin, drop a comment telling us which city you're watching from, and once the story ends, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Oh, and make sure to follow our channel for more stories like this. Now, sit back and enjoy every detail. The crystal chandeliers cast warm golden light across the Harlow family estate, illuminating faces flushed with champagne and holiday cheer. Christmas Eve had always been sacred in the Harlow household, a night when business calls were forbidden and family took precedence over fortune. Tonight should have been no different. Dorian Harlow stood near the marble fireplace, his tall frame impeccably dressed in a charcoal Tom Ford suit that emphasized his broad shoulders and athletic build. At 36, he commanded every room he entered, not just because of his billionaire status in telecommunications, but because of the quiet confidence that radiated from his piercing green eyes and the way his dark brown hair was styled with effortless precision. "You're brooding again," his sister Catherine observed, approaching with 2 glasses of vintage wine. Her red velvet dress complemented her auburn hair, and her knowing smile suggested she'd been watching him for some time. "It's Christmas Eve, Dorian. The least you could do is pretend to enjoy our company." Dorian accepted the wine with a wry smile. "I'm enjoying myself perfectly fine." But even as he spoke, his eyes drifted toward the tall windows overlooking the Connecticut countryside, where snow fell in gentle flurries against the glass. 6 months. It had been 6 months since he'd walked away from Sienna Marlowe and the life they'd been building together. "Liar," Catherine said simply. "You've been checking your phone every 10 minutes. Are you expecting a call?" The truth was, Dorian had been expecting many things over the past months: anger, demands, legal papers. What he hadn't expected was silence. Complete, deafening silence from the woman who'd once filled every corner of his world with laughter and love. Sienna had simply disappeared from his life, taking with her not just their relationship, but any trace of the future they'd planned. "Dorian, dear, come settle a debate for us," his mother Eleanor called from across the room, her silver hair elegantly styled and her navy blue dress making her look every inch the sophisticated matriarch she was. "Your father insists that skiing in Aspen after New Year's is too cliché, but I maintain that traditions exist for a reason." William Harlow, distinguished in his 70s with salt and pepper hair and laugh lines that spoke of decades of success, raised his glass in mock surrender. "I merely suggested we could explore Switzerland this year, broaden our horizons." "Switzerland sounds perfect," Dorian replied, forcing enthusiasm into his voice. He could play the part of the devoted son, the successful businessman, the man who had everything under control. He'd been perfecting this performance for months. The conversation flowed around him like background noise, discussions of vacation plans, business ventures, the latest family friends engagement. Dorian nodded at appropriate intervals, smiled when expected, but his mind remained elsewhere. In a small apartment in Brooklyn where Sienna used to make Sunday morning pancakes, in the corner office where she'd surprised him with lunch during particularly stressful days, in the jewelry store where he'd spent 3 weeks selecting the perfect engagement ring that now sat unused in his bedroom safe. "You know what you need?" Catherine continued, undeterred by his distant expression. "You need to stop punishing yourself for making a difficult decision. Relationships end, Dorian. It happens to everyone. But that wasn't entirely true, was it? Their relationship hadn't simply ended. It had been obliterated by his own cowardice. When Sienna had told him she was pregnant, his first reaction had been pure joy. He'd held her, spun her around their kitchen, talked excitedly about nursery colors and baby names. For 3 beautiful months, they'd been planning their family together. Then reality had set in. The arguments started small, disagreements about moving in together officially, about whether Sienna should continue her demanding job as a social worker, about how to balance their very different worlds. Dorian's wealth came with expectations, scrutiny, a level of public attention that Sienna had never asked for. The more he tried to protect her from it, the more she felt like he was controlling her choices. "I don't need a golden cage," she'd said during their last argument. "I need a partner who trusts me to make my own decisions." But Dorian had been afraid of losing her to the pressures of his world, afraid of failing as a father, the way his own father had often been absent during his childhood, afraid that love wouldn't be enough to bridge the gap between their vastly different backgrounds. So instead of fighting for what they had, he'd walked away, told himself it was better for everyone, especially for their child if he removed himself from the equation. Let Sienna build the life she wanted without the complications that came with being involved with a Harlow. The conversation around him shifted to business, and Dorian found himself discussing the upcoming quarterly reports with his father and Uncle James. It was safer territory. Numbers, projections, strategic planning, things he could control and understand, unlike the mess he'd made of his personal life. The telecommunications merger is moving forward smoothly, he reported, his voice steady and professional. We should see significant growth in the Northeast markets by spring. Excellent, William nodded approvingly. You've built something remarkable, son. The company's never been stronger. Success, recognition, financial security. Dorian had everything he'd worked toward his entire adult life. So why did he feel so empty? Why did every achievement feel hollow without someone special to share it with? Dorian? Catherine touched his arm gently. Are you all right? You look pale. Before he could answer, the distinct buzz of his phone cut through the festive atmosphere. The caller ID made his blood run cold. Hartford General Hospital. His hands trembled as he stepped away from the group, finding a quiet corner near the Christmas tree. The scent of pine and cinnamon that had seemed comforting moments before now felt overwhelming. This is Dorian Harlow, he answered, his voice barely steady. Mr. Harlow? This is Nurse Patricia from Hartford General's maternity ward. I'm calling about Sienna Marlowe. You're listed as her emergency contact. The world tilted. Emergency contact. After 6 months of silence, his name was still the first one she'd trust in a crisis. What's happened? Is she all right? The questions tumbled out before he could stop them. She's in active labor, Mr. Harlow. She's been asking for you. Active labor. The baby. Their baby. The child he'd tried so hard to forget was arriving. Tonight, on Christmas Eve, while he stood in his family's pristine living room pretending his heart wasn't shattered. I'll be right there, he said without hesitation, already moving toward the foyer where his coat hung waiting. Dorian, what's wrong? Eleanor called after him, concern evident in her voice as she noticed his sudden urgency. He paused at the doorway, looking back at his family, at the warm, comfortable world he'd chosen over the uncertain, beautiful chaos of building a life with Sienna. The Christmas tree lights blurred as emotion threatened to overwhelm him. I have to go, he managed. There's someone I need to. Catherine appeared at his side, her expression understanding. Go, she said simply. Whatever this is, go. Dorian grabbed his coat and car keys, his mind racing as he stepped out into the snowy Connecticut night. The drive to Hartford would take 45 minutes in good weather. Tonight, with the snow falling heavier now, it might take longer. As he started his Aston Martin and pulled out of the circular driveway, leaving the warm glow of his family home behind, one thought echoed relentlessly in his mind. Sienna was having their baby, and she'd asked for him. After 6 months of silence, of convinced himself he'd made the right choice by walking away, she'd asked for him. The fluorescent lights of Hartford General Hospital felt harsh after the warm glow of his family's estate. Dorian's polished dress shoes echoed against the sterile linoleum floors as he followed the directions to the maternity ward, his heart hammering against his ribs with each step. He'd made the drive in 38 minutes, a reckless pace through the snowy Connecticut roads that would have horrified his usual cautious nature. But nothing about this night felt usual. His hands still trembled slightly as he approached the nurse's station, where a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying hair looked up from her charts. I'm Dorian Harlow, he said, his voice hoarse from the tension. You called about Sienna Marlowe. Nurse Patricia's expression softened with recognition. Mr. Harlow, yes. She's in room 314. The doctor is with her now. She paused, studying his face with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen countless expectant fathers in various states of panic. Are you all right? You look like you might need a moment. A moment. He'd needed 6 months of moments to process what he'd walked away from. Now, standing outside the room where Sienna was bringing their child into the world, Dorian realized no amount of time could have prepared him for this. How is she? He managed. Strong, Patricia replied with a reassuring smile. She's been handling everything beautifully, though she's been asking for you for the past hour. I should warn you, labor can be intense for first-time fathers. Are you ready for this? Ready. The question seemed almost laughable. 6 months ago, he'd convinced himself he could never be ready for fatherhood, that his demanding career and complicated world would make him a terrible parent. He'd used that fear to justify walking away from the woman he loved and the family they could have built together. I don't think anyone's ever truly ready, he admitted quietly. Patricia nodded knowingly. The best parents are the ones who worry about doing it right. Room 314 is just down the hall. Take a breath first. Dorian walked slowly toward the room, each step feeling monumental. Through the partially open door he could hear voices. A doctor speaking in calm, professional tones, and then Sienna's voice, strained but determined. The sound hit him like a physical blow, bringing back memories of lazy Sunday mornings when her laughter would wake him, of late-night conversations about their dreams and fears. He knocked gently and pushed the door open. The woman in the hospital bed bore only a passing resemblance to the Sienna he remembered. Her usually vibrant chestnut-brown hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, damp with perspiration. Her face was flushed and tired, but her blue eyes, those stunning sapphire eyes that had captured his attention at a charity gala 3 years ago, were as striking as ever. When they landed on him, they filled with a mixture of relief, pain, and something else he couldn't quite identify. "Dorian," she breathed, and the way she said his name with such raw vulnerability nearly brought him to his knees. Dr. Martinez, a composed woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair, looked up from her position at the foot of the bed. "You must be Dad," she said with professional warmth. "Perfect timing. We're making excellent progress here." Dad. The word hung in the air between them. Dorian had spent months trying to convince himself he didn't deserve that title, that he'd forfeited any right to it when he'd chosen his fears over his family. "You came," Sienna whispered, tears pooling in her eyes. "Of course I came." Dorian approached the bed cautiously as if she might disappear if he moved too quickly. "I'm so sorry, Sienna. I'm sorry for everything." Another contraction seized her, and Sienna gripped the bed rails, her face contorting with effort. Instinctively, Dorian reached for her hand, and she grasped it like a lifeline. Her fingers were smaller than he remembered, but her grip was fierce and determined. "That was a strong one," Dr. Martinez observed, checking her monitors. "We're getting closer. Sienna, you're doing beautifully." As the contraction passed, Sienna's grip on his hand loosened slightly, but she didn't let go. "I didn't know if you'd want to, if you'd even care that—" "Hey," Dorian interrupted gently, using his free hand to brush a damp strand of hair from her forehead. "Don't say that. I've cared every single day. I've thought about you both every single day." "Then why did you leave?" The question was barely a whisper, but it cut through him like a blade. How could he explain the fear that had consumed him? The terror of repeating his father's mistakes, of being so consumed by business that he'd miss the important moments, the overwhelming feeling that his wealth and status would somehow corrupt the pure love they'd shared. "Because I was afraid," he admitted, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. "I was afraid of failing you, of failing our child. I convinced myself that you'd be better off without me." Sienna's eyes flashed with anger, even through her exhaustion. "That wasn't your choice to make, Dorian. We could have worked through the fears together. That's what people who love each other do." "I know," he said quietly. "I know that now." Another contraction built stronger than before, and Sienna's hand tightened around his again. This time, Dorian didn't just hold her hand. He leaned closer, whispering words of encouragement that came from somewhere deep and instinctual. "You're incredible," he murmured. "You're the strongest person I've ever known. We need to push soon," Dr. Martinez announced, her voice taking on a more urgent tone. "Dad, are you staying for the delivery?" Dorian looked at Sienna questioningly. After everything he'd put her through, he had no right to assume his place in this moment. But she nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Stay," she whispered. "Please stay." "I'm not going anywhere," he promised. And for the first time in 6 months, he meant it completely. The next 20 minutes blurred together in a haze of coaching breaths, encouraging words, and the gradual realization that he was witnessing the most miraculous thing he'd ever experienced. Sienna's determination was breathtaking. Even in her exhaustion, she fought for every push, every breath, every moment that brought their child closer to the world. And then, suddenly, there was a cry. A tiny, perfect cry that silenced every fear, every doubt, every carefully constructed justification Dorian had built over the past 6 months. "It's a boy," Dr. Martinez announced with a smile, holding up a small, squirming bundle. "A beautiful, healthy boy." Dorian stared at his son, with wonder and terror and love so overwhelming it physically hurt. The baby was tiny and red and absolutely perfect, with a shock of dark hair and lungs that clearly worked magnificently. "Would you like to cut the cord, Dad?" Dr. Martinez asked. With shaking hands, Dorian performed his first official act as a father, severing the physical connection between his son and the woman who'd carried him safely for 9 months. As the doctor cleaned and wrapped the baby, Dorian turned to Sienna, who was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Sienna," he began, but she shook her head weakly. "Not now," she said softly. Let's just meet our son first." Dr. Martinez approached with the baby, now clean and wrapped in a soft blue blanket. "Here's your Christmas miracle," she said, placing the infant in Sienna's arms. Dorian watched as Sienna looked at their son for the first time, her face transforming with a love so pure and immediate that it took his breath away. The baby's eyes were closed, his tiny fists curled near his face, completely peaceful in his mother's arms. "Hello, little one," Sienna whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm your mama." After a moment, she looked up at Dorian. "Would you like to hold him?" Dorian nodded, not trusting his voice. With infinite care, Sienna transferred their son to his arms, and suddenly Dorian understood why people talked about life-changing moments. This wasn't just a shift in his world. This was a complete reconstruction of everything he thought he knew about himself. The baby was warm and solid and so small that Dorian was afraid to breathe too deeply. But as he looked down at his son's peaceful face, something settled into place in his chest. Something that had been missing for longer than just the past 6 months. "What's his name?" he asked quietly. Sienna was quiet for so long that Dorian looked up, finding her watching him with those penetrating blue eyes. "I was thinking," she said slowly, "maybe we could decide that together." The next few hours passed in a surreal haze of gentle chaos that Dorian had never experienced before. The maternity ward had settled into its quiet overnight rhythm, but inside room 314, 3 lives were being carefully rearranged around a tiny person who had no idea he'd just changed everything. Sienna dozed fitfully against the raised hospital bed, her chestnut hair fanned across the white pillow. The exhaustion of labor had finally caught up with her, and Dorian found himself grateful for these quiet moments to simply watch her sleep. Even in rest, she looked different, not just tired but transformed in some fundamental way that went beyond physical changes. There was a new strength in her features, a maternal confidence that seemed to radiate from her even in sleep. Their son, still nameless, lay in the clear plastic bassinet beside the bed, occasionally making tiny sounds that sent Dorian's heart racing with protective instinct. Every flutter of the baby's eyelids, every small movement of his perfect fingers, felt like a miracle that Dorian didn't deserve to witness. The chair beside Sienna's bed was uncomfortable, but Dorian hadn't moved from it in 3 hours. He couldn't. Every time he considered stepping away, even for a moment, the fear that this was all some elaborate dream would overwhelm him, that he'd wake up back in his empty penthouse apartment, alone with his regrets and his carefully maintained distance from everything that mattered. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Nurse Patricia entered quietly, her experienced eyes taking in the scene with professional assessment and maternal warmth. "How are we doing in here?" she whispered, checking the monitors and glancing at the sleeping baby. "Good," Dorian replied quietly, though he wasn't entirely sure what good meant in this context. "She's been sleeping for about an hour. That's exactly what she needs." Patricia nodded, making notes on Sienna's chart. "Labor takes everything out of you. She'll need plenty of rest over the next few days." She paused, studying Dorian with those perceptive eyes. "What about you? When's the last time you ate something?" The question caught him off guard. Food seemed irrelevant when his entire world had just been reconstructed around this tiny person and the woman who'd brought him into existence. But now that Patricia mentioned it, Dorian realized he hadn't eaten since the hors d'oeuvres at his family's Christmas Eve gathering. A lifetime ago, though it had only been hours. "I'm fine," he said automatically, the response of someone accustomed to handling everything on his own. Patricia's expression suggested she'd heard that particular lie from many new fathers. "There's a decent cafeteria on the 2nd floor, and the vending machines have sandwiches if you need something quick. You won't be any good to either of them if you collapse from hunger." Before Dorian could respond, Sienna stirred, her blue eyes fluttering open with the disoriented confusion of someone waking in an unfamiliar place. For a moment, she looked around the room with genuine bewilderment, and Dorian felt his heart clench at her vulnerability. "Hey," he said softly, leaning forward in his chair. "You're okay. You're at the hospital. Everything's fine." Recognition flooded her features, followed immediately by maternal instinct as her gaze flew to the bassinet. "The baby, is he perfect?" Patricia assured her with a warm smile. Absolutely perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, good strong lungs. He's been sleeping peacefully. Sienna's shoulders relaxed as she took in her son's peaceful form. Then her attention shifted to Dorian, and something complicated flickered across her face. Gratitude mixed with uncertainty, relief tempered by old pain. You stayed, she said, and it wasn't quite a question. I told you I would. You've told me a lot of things over the years, Sienna replied, but there was no venom in her words, just exhaustion, and a lifetime of caution that Dorian knew he'd earned through his own choices. Patricia cleared her throat diplomatically. I'll give you two some privacy. Ring if you need anything. She paused at the door. And Mr. Harlow? Seriously, go get something to eat. Doctor's orders. When they were alone, the room felt smaller, more intimate. Dorian could hear the soft sounds of the baby's breathing, the gentle hum of medical equipment, and the distant activity of the hospital beyond their door. But mostly, he was aware of Sienna watching him with those penetrating blue eyes that had always seen too much. You look terrible, she said finally, and despite everything, there was a hint of affection in her voice. Dorian ran a hand through his hair, realizing he probably looked nothing like the polished businessman who'd left his family's estate hours earlier. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his tie long since discarded, and he could feel the emotional weight of the night etched in every line of his face. It's been a long night, he admitted. For both of us. Sienna shifted carefully in the bed, wincing slightly at the movement. Dorian, about what I said earlier, about deciding on a name together. I didn't mean to assume Sienna. He moved his chair closer to the bed, close enough that he could see the flecks of silver in her blue eyes. I know I have no right to ask for anything from you. I know I forfeited any claim to being part of this when I walked away, but if you'll let me, I want to try to be the father he deserves, and the partner you should have had all along. She was quiet for a long moment, her gaze moving between him and their sleeping son. When she spoke, her voice was careful and measured. I spent 6 months convincing myself that I could do this alone, that I was better off without someone who could just disappear when things got complicated. Her fingers twisted the hospital blanket as she spoke. I had to build walls, Dorian. I had to protect myself and protect him from the possibility that you might hurt us again. I understand that, Dorian said quietly. And I don't expect you to tear those walls down just because I showed up tonight. I know I have to earn your trust back. Both of yours. It's not just about trust, Sienna continued, her voice stronger now. It's about partnership, real partnership. I can't go through pregnancy and labor and motherhood wondering if you're going to get scared and run again the moment things get difficult. The baby stirred in his bassinet, making a small sound that immediately drew both their attention. His tiny face scrunched briefly before settling back into peaceful sleep, completely unaware of the conversation that would shape his entire future. What are you thinking for names? Dorian asked, hoping to ease some of the tension in the room. A small smile played at the corners of Sienna's mouth, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since he'd walked through the door. I've had a few ideas. Nothing definite. She paused. I liked the name Gabriel. It means, God is my strength. Gabriel, Dorian repeated, testing the name. Gabriel Harlow. He looked at his son, at Gabriel, and felt something settle into place. It's perfect. Gabriel Marlowe Harlow. Sienna corrected gently but firmly. The hyphenation was a boundary, a way of maintaining her independence even as they navigated this new reality together. Dorian understood that, respected it even. She wasn't just going to fold back into his life as if nothing had happened. Gabriel Marlowe Harlow, he agreed. It's still perfect. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, both watching their son sleep. The weight of the conversation, of the decisions they still needed to make, hung in the air between them. But for now, in this quiet hospital room on Christmas morning, it felt like enough to simply be present. Dorian, Sienna said eventually, her voice soft but serious, if we're going to try this, if we're going to figure out how to be parents together, we need to be honest with each other. About everything. Okay, he replied, though something in her tone made him nervous. There are things you don't know about the past 6 months, things I had to deal with on my own. She took a deep breath. After you left, I had some complications. Nothing serious, she added quickly, seeing his alarmed expression. But there were a few scares, times when I was terrified and alone and really needed someone who cared about both of us. The guilt hit Dorian like a physical blow. While he'd been wallowing in his own fears and regrets, She'd been facing real danger, real fear, completely alone. Sienna, I'm not telling you this to make you feel guilty, she interrupted. I'm telling you because if we're going to move forward, you need to understand what partnership actually means. It means showing up for the scary parts, not just the beautiful moments. Dorian looked at Gabriel, at this tiny person who represented everything he'd almost lost through his own cowardice, and made a decision that felt like the first truly adult choice of his life. Then I'm showing up, he said firmly, for all of it. The beautiful parts and the terrifying parts and everything in between. I'm showing up, Sienna, I promise. She studied his face for a long moment, searching for something he hoped she would find. We'll see, she said finally. We'll see. 3 days later, Dorian found himself standing in the nursery of Sienna's Brooklyn apartment, holding Gabriel while she showered for the first time since leaving the hospital. The small room was nothing like the elaborate nursery he'd imagined designing in his penthouse. There were no expensive Italian cribs or designer mobiles. Instead, everything was practical and carefully chosen, each item representing Sienna's meticulous planning and the reality of preparing for a baby on a social worker's salary. The walls were painted a soft sage green, and handmade decorations hung above the simple white crib. A rocking chair sat in the corner, second-hand but refinished with care. Everything spoke of love and thoughtfulness rather than luxury, and Dorian found himself humbled by the warmth of it. Gabriel stirred in his arms, making tiny sounds that Dorian was learning to interpret. Hungry cry versus tired cry, versus the simple need for comfort. 3 days of fatherhood had taught him that babies had their own complex language, and he was still very much a beginner at translation. Hey, little man, he murmured, adjusting his hold slightly. Gabriel's dark hair was already showing signs of curl, and his eyes, when they opened, were a deep blue that reminded Dorian of Sienna's. Your mama's getting cleaned up, so it's just you and me for a few minutes. The apartment was small but cozy, filled with the kind of personal touches that made a place feel like home. Photographs covered the refrigerator, Sienna with friends, family gatherings, moments from the life she'd built without him. It was a stark reminder that she'd moved on, created a support system, found ways to be happy even after he'd shattered their plans. The sound of running water stopped, and a few minutes later, Sienna emerged from the bathroom looking more like herself than she had since Christmas Eve. Her hair was still damp, but she'd changed into comfortable clothes, soft leggings and an oversized sweater that somehow made her look both maternal and beautiful. How's he been? She asked, settling onto the couch with a visible sigh of relief. Perfect, Dorian replied, though he was still marveling at how natural this felt. Standing in her apartment, holding their son, talking about the mundane details of new parenthood. I think he might be getting hungry soon. Sienna nodded, extending her arms. I can hear it in his breathing. He's working up to a proper demand for food. As Dorian transferred Gabriel to her arms, their hands brushed briefly, and he felt that familiar electric connection that had always existed between them. Sienna must have felt it too, because she looked up at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. You don't have to stay, she said quietly. I know you have work, responsibilities. I've been managing on my own. I want to stay, Dorian replied, if that's okay with you. The truth was, he'd canceled 3 important meetings and delegated his most pressing business to his assistant. For the first time in his adult life, work felt secondary to something more important. The telecommunications empire could function without him for a few days, while he figured out how to be present for the family he'd almost lost. Dorian, Sienna began, then paused as Gabriel began to fuss. We should probably talk about practicalities, about what this looks like going forward. Okay, he said, settling into the chair across from her. She began nursing Gabriel with the practiced ease of someone who'd been doing this for 3 days, and Dorian felt a complex mixture of awe and regret watching them together. This was what he'd missed. Not just the dramatic moment of birth, but these quiet, intimate moments that made up the daily reality of caring for a child. I can't afford this place long-term with a baby, Sienna said matter-of-factly. I've been looking at smaller apartments, maybe further from the city, somewhere the rent won't eat up my entire salary. You don't have to move, Dorian said quickly. I can help with the rent. I want to help. Sienna's expression grew cautious. I don't want your money, Dorian. I want your presence. There's a difference. I know, he replied. But I also know that financial stress isn't good for any of us. Let me take care of practical things so you can focus on taking care of Gabriel. "And what do you get out of that arrangement?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. The question was fair, and Dorian could see the wariness in her eyes. She was protecting herself against the possibility that his support would come with strings attached, conditions that would give him control over her choices. "I get to be part of his life," Dorian said honestly. "I get to be part of both your lives, if you'll let me." Gabriel finished nursing and Sienna shifted him to her shoulder, patting his back gently. The domestic intimacy of the moment made Dorian's chest tight with longing for all the moments like this he'd missed, all the simple daily rituals of family life he'd convinced himself he didn't want. "There's something else," Sienna said, her voice hesitant. "My lease is up at the end of February. I was thinking, maybe this is a chance to start fresh somewhere, away from all the memories of before." The words hit Dorian harder than expected. The idea of Sienna taking Gabriel and disappearing to some unknown city, building a life he had no part in, filled him with panic. "Away from me, you mean?" he said quietly. "Away from the complications," she corrected, but her tone suggested the distinction might be meaningless. Gabriel let out a small burp, and Sienna smiled down at him with such pure love that Dorian felt his heart contract. She was an incredible mother, patient, intuitive, completely devoted. Gabriel was lucky to have her, but the thought of watching them leave, of being relegated to weekend visits and holiday phone calls, was unbearable. "What if we found a place together?" Dorian asked, the words coming out before he'd fully thought them through. Sienna's eyes snapped to his, wide with surprise. "Together?" "Not together, he clarified quickly, though part of him wished that was an option. "But close. Maybe a duplex or apartments in the same building. Somewhere Gabriel could have both of us nearby without either of us having to give up our independence." She was quiet for a long moment, considering. Gabriel had fallen asleep against her shoulder, completely content and unaware of the conversation that would shape his childhood. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why is this so important to you now when it wasn't important enough 6 months ago?" It was the question Dorian had been asking himself since Christmas Eve, and he still wasn't sure he could articulate the answer in a way that would make sense to someone who hadn't lived through the fear that had driven him away. "Because I was an idiot 6 months ago," he said simply. "Because I let fear make decisions that love should have made. Because holding him, watching you with him, being here in this apartment that you turned into a home for our son, it made me realize that everything I thought was important actually means nothing without the two of you." Sienna's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back quickly. "Pretty words, Dorian, but I need more than pretty words this time." "Then what do you need?" he asked. "Tell me what you need and I'll do it." "I need consistency," she replied without hesitation. "I need someone who shows up for the 3 a.m. feedings and the pediatrician appointments and the mundane Tuesday afternoons, when nothing special is happening, but Gabriel needs his parents to be present. I can do that. I need someone who won't run when Gabriel gets sick, or when he's difficult, or when being a parent becomes inconvenient to your business schedule. I can do that too." Sienna studied his face, searching for something he hoped she would find. Gabriel sighed in his sleep and she adjusted her hold on him automatically. The movement so natural it spoke to instincts Dorian was just beginning to develop. "There's one more thing," she said quietly. "I need someone who wants to be here not because they feel guilty or obligated, but because this is where they choose to be. Because we're worth choosing, every single day." Dorian stood up and moved to the couch, sitting beside her carefully. Gabriel was between them, small and perfect and completely dependent on the adults in his life to make the right choices. "Sienna," Dorian said, his voice steady with conviction, "you are worth choosing every single day. Both of you. I was too afraid to see that before, but I see it now. And if you give me the chance, I'll spend every day proving that I'm worth choosing too." She looked at him for a long moment, then down at Gabriel, then back at him. "We'll start with finding a place," she said finally. "Separate spaces, but close. We'll see how that works." It wasn't everything Dorian wanted, but it was a beginning. And after 6 months of having nothing, a beginning felt like everything. 2 weeks later, Dorian stood in the living room of a beautiful duplex in Park Slope, watching Sienna walk through the space with Gabriel in her arms. The afternoon light streamed through large windows, illuminating hardwood floors and built-in bookshelves that gave the place character and warmth. "The upstairs unit has 3 bedrooms," the real estate agent Margaret explained enthusiastically. "Perfect for a growing family. And the downstairs has 2 bedrooms plus a home office space." Sienna nodded politely, but Dorian could see the tension in her shoulders. They'd looked at 6 properties over the past 2 weeks, and each time he could feel her pulling away slightly whenever the reality of their arrangement became too concrete. "Could we have a few minutes alone?" Dorian asked Margaret, who nodded and stepped outside to make phone calls. When they were alone, Sienna sat carefully on the window seat, adjusting Gabriel in her arms. He was growing rapidly, already looking less like a newborn and more like a tiny person with distinct preferences and personality traits emerging daily. "It's beautiful," she said quietly, but something in her tone suggested that wasn't necessarily a good thing. "But?" Dorian prompted, settling into a chair across from her. "But it's expensive, really expensive. Even with you paying for the downstairs unit, the upstairs rent is more than I make in 2 months." She looked around the room with appreciation tinged by anxiety. "This isn't sustainable for me long-term, Dorian. What happens when you get tired of playing house? When your board of directors decides you're being irresponsible with your time and attention?" The question stung because they were fair. Dorian had built his entire adult life around the principle that business came first, that personal relationships were secondary to professional success. Changing that pattern, proving that his priorities had truly shifted, would take more than words and good intentions. "My assistant has been handling most of my meetings," he said. "Video conferences for anything that requires my direct input. It's working fine." "For now," Sienna replied. "But you can't run a telecommunications empire from your laptop indefinitely. Eventually, you'll need to go back to your normal schedule." Gabriel made a small sound and stretched in his sleep, one tiny fist escaping from his blanket. Both parents immediately focused on him, the conversation pausing as they watched for signs that he might be waking up. "Maybe we should look at something smaller," Sienna continued once Gabriel settled back into peaceful sleep. "More realistic for my actual budget. Or maybe," Dorian said carefully, "you could let me help more than you're comfortable with." "I don't want to be financially dependent on you," Sienna said firmly. "I've worked too hard to build my independence to give it up now." "It wouldn't be giving up your independence. It would be accepting help from Gabriel's father." "There's a difference between help and control, Dorian, and sometimes the line between them gets blurry when there's a lot of money involved." She was right, and Dorian knew it. He'd seen it happen countless times in his business world. Relationships that became transactional, power dynamics that shifted when one person held all the financial cards. The last thing he wanted was for Sienna to feel trapped by his resources. "What if I set up a trust for Gabriel?" he suggested. "Something that ensures his needs are met without making you dependent on my goodwill." Sienna looked up from Gabriel to study Dorian's face. "What kind of trust? Educational fund? Healthcare coverage? General support? Managed by a third party so you have access to what Gabriel needs without having to ask me for permission? And what about day-to-day expenses? Groceries, clothes, the pediatrician visits that aren't covered by insurance?" Dorian had been thinking about this exact question for days, trying to find a solution that would support his son without undermining Sienna's autonomy. "Child support," he said simply. "Formal legal child support that gives you financial security without strings attached." For the first time in their conversation, Sienna looked genuinely surprised. "You want to formalize this? Legally?" "I want to make sure Gabriel is provided for no matter what happens between us," Dorian replied. "And I want you to feel secure enough to make choices based on what's best for both of you, not what's financially necessary." Gabriel stirred again, this time opening his eyes and looking around with that unfocused but alert expression newborns got when they were trying to make sense of their environment. Sienna automatically began the gentle bouncing motion that seemed to soothe him. "There's something else we need to discuss," she said, her voice taking on a more serious tone. "My maternity leave ends in 6 weeks. I need to go back to work." "Do you want to go back?" Dorian asked. "I love my job," Sienna said without hesitation. "I love helping families navigate crisis situations, and I'm good at it. But I also love being with Gabriel, and the idea of leaving him with strangers for 8 hours a day makes me feel sick." "So don't," Dorian said. "Take more time, or work part-time, whatever you need. It's not that simple. If I don't go back, I lose my health insurance. I lose the professional identity I've spent years building. I lose the security of knowing I can support myself and Gabriel independently." The conflict in her voice was clear, and Dorian felt a familiar surge of protectiveness mixed with frustration at his own limitations. He could solve the financial aspects of this problem easily, but he couldn't restore her sense of professional purpose or eliminate the fear that taking his help would cost her too much independence. "What if you could do both?" he asked. "Keep your job but have more flexibility?" "How?" I know people at several family service organizations in the city. Good organizations that value experienced social workers and offer better work-life balance. Maybe we could find you a position that lets you be the professional you want to be while also being the mother you want to be. Sienna was quiet for a long moment, processing the suggestion. Gabriel had fallen back asleep in her arms, completely trusting in her ability to keep him safe and comfortable. "You'd do that?" she asked finally. "Use your connections to help me find a job?" "Of course I would. Gabriel benefits when his mother is happy and fulfilled. And you've worked too hard to build your career to have to sacrifice it because you became a parent." "Most men wouldn't see it that way," Sienna observed. "I'm not most men," Dorian replied. "At least I'm trying not to be." She looked around the duplex again, but this time her expression was thoughtful rather than anxious. If we took this place and you helped me find a more flexible position, what would you want in return?" "Time with Gabriel," Dorian said honestly, "and time with you, even if it's just as co-parents. I want to be part of your daily lives, not just the guy who shows up for birthdays and holidays. And when your business demands more of your attention, when there are crises that require you to travel or work 18-hour days, then I'll handle those situations differently than I have in the past," Dorian said. "I'll delegate more. I'll prioritize differently. I'll make sure that Gabriel and you come first even when that's inconvenient for business." "That's a big promise, Dorian. It's the most important promise I'll ever make." Sienna stood up and walked to the large window that overlooked a tree-lined street, where other families were walking with strollers and children rode bikes on the sidewalk. It was the kind of neighborhood where Gabriel could grow up safely, surrounded by the rhythms of family life. "Okay," she said finally, turning back to face him. "We'll try it. The duplex, the trust, the job search, all of it." "Really?" "Really. But Dorian, if this doesn't work, if you can't handle the balance between your business life and being present for Gabriel, we'll need to find a different arrangement." "It'll work," Dorian said with more confidence than he'd felt about anything in months. "How can you be so sure?" "Because for the first time in my life I have something more important than business success," he replied. "I have both of you." The moving truck pulled away from the Park Slope duplex just as the late February sun was beginning to set, leaving Dorian and Sienna standing in the doorway of what would be their new normal. Gabriel was strapped to Sienna's chest in a baby carrier, wide awake and taking in his new surroundings with the serious expression he'd developed over the past month. "I can't believe we actually did this," Sienna said, looking around at the boxes stacked in what would become Gabriel's nursery upstairs. "Having second thoughts?" Dorian asked, though he sincerely hoped the answer was no. The past 3 weeks of planning, packing, and coordinating had felt like the most productive period of his life, not because of any business deal or professional achievement, but because every decision had been made with Gabriel's well-being at the center. "No," Sienna replied, and she sounded genuinely sure. "Just overwhelmed, I think. Good overwhelmed, mostly." Dorian's own apartment downstairs was still a maze of boxes, but he'd prioritized getting Gabriel's room set up first. The crib was assembled, the changing table stocked, and a comfortable rocking chair positioned by the window where Sienna could nurse while looking out at the tree-lined street. "I should start dinner," Sienna said, though she made no move toward the kitchen. "We've been living on takeout for days." "I can cook," Dorian offered. "Or we can order something else tonight and worry about domestic routines tomorrow." "You can cook?" Sienna asked with surprise and a hint of amusement. "I've picked up a few skills over the years," Dorian replied, realizing how little they actually knew about each other's daily lives despite having dated for 3 years and now raising a child together. "Nothing fancy, but I can manage basic meals." Gabriel made a small sound and both adults immediately focused on him, the conversation pausing as they tried to interpret whether he was comfortable or needed something. It was a pattern they'd fallen into, this shared vigilance that felt both natural and completely foreign to Dorian's pre-fatherhood existence. "He's probably hungry," Sienna said, recognizing the subtle signs that Dorian was still learning to read. "I should feed him before we try to tackle any more unpacking." She settled into the rocking chair they'd positioned in the living room, and Dorian found himself struck by how perfectly she fit into this space. The duplex was beautiful, but modest, a far cry from his penthouse apartment across town, but somehow it felt more like home than anywhere he'd ever lived. "Dorian," Sienna said quietly as Gabriel nursed, "I had a call today. About a job. The family services position." He'd made several calls on her behalf, reaching out to contacts at organizations he thought would appreciate her experience, and offer the flexibility she needed. Community Family Support Services in Manhattan. They want to interview me next week. Her voice was carefully neutral, but Dorian could hear the excitement underneath. It's a senior caseworker position with the option to work from home 2 days a week. That's incredible, Dorian said, and meant it. How are you feeling about it? Nervous, excited, grateful that you made those calls. She looked up at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. It feels strange, having someone advocate for me professionally. I've been doing everything on my own for so long. You don't have to do everything on your own anymore, Dorian said gently. That's the point of this whole arrangement. I know, Sienna replied. It's just, adjustment is harder than I expected. Even good adjustment. Gabriel finished nursing and Sienna shifted him to her shoulder, patting his back gently. The domestic rhythm of it was something Dorian was becoming addicted to. These quiet moments when the three of them existed as a unit, connected by more than just biological ties. There's something else, Sienna continued, her voice taking on a more serious tone. The interview is the same day as Gabriel's 2-month checkup. I know you said you wanted to be involved in medical appointments, but I'll be there, Dorian interrupted. For both. We can schedule the interview around the doctor's appointment, or I can take Gabriel to the pediatrician while you handle the interview. You'd do that? Take him to a medical appointment alone? The question revealed something Dorian was still grappling with. Sienna's lingering uncertainty about his commitment, her need to test whether his promises would hold up under practical pressure. Of course I would. He's my son too. I know. But medical stuff can be overwhelming, and you're still learning how to… Sienna, Dorian interrupted gently. I'm still learning how to do all of this, but that doesn't mean I'm going to avoid the parts that seem difficult. Gabriel needs both of his parents to be capable and present, and I can't become capable if I don't practice. Gabriel let out a small burp and immediately settled back to sleep against Sienna's shoulder, completely trusting in his parents' ability to keep him safe. The sight never failed to humble Dorian, this tiny person who depended on them for everything, who had no choice but to trust that the adults in his life would make good decisions. I've been thinking about something, Sienna said, her voice softer now, about how we explain this to people. The duplex arrangement, I mean. People are going to have questions. What kind of questions? About whether we're together, about what our relationship actually is, about Gabriel's last name and custody arrangements and all the complicated things that don't fit into neat categories. Dorian had been wondering about the same things, but he'd been afraid to bring up the subject for fear of pushing too hard too fast. Their arrangement was working. Better than working, actually, but it existed in a kind of undefined space that left room for misunderstanding. What do you want to tell people? He asked. I don't know, Sienna admitted. The truth? That we're figuring it out as we go? That we're committed to being good parents even if we're not sure what that means for us as individuals? That sounds honest, Dorian replied. Honest doesn't always make people comfortable. Your family, for instance. Are they expecting us to get back together? To get married for Gabriel's sake? The question hit closer to home than Dorian was prepared for. His family had been cautiously supportive of the duplex arrangement, but he could see the questions in their eyes, the assumption that this was a stepping stone toward something more traditional. My family wants what's best for Gabriel, he said carefully. Beyond that, our relationship isn't really their business. And what do you think is best for Gabriel? It was the question that kept Dorian awake at night, the one that made every decision feel weighted with consequence. What was best for Gabriel? Stability? Love? 2 parents who got along? 2 parents who loved each other? 2 parents who prioritized his needs above their own complicated feelings? I think Gabriel needs parents who are present and consistent and willing to put his well-being first, Dorian said finally. Everything else is secondary to that. Even if those parents aren't romantically involved? Even then. Sienna was quiet for a long moment, studying his face. Gabriel had fallen into the deep sleep of a well-fed baby, completely peaceful in his mother's arms. I appreciate that you're not pushing, she said eventually, for more than this. A lot of men would assume that living this close, raising Gabriel together, would automatically lead to picking up where we left off. We can't pick up where we left off, Dorian replied honestly. Too much has happened. We're different people than we were 6 months ago. Yes, Sienna agreed. We are, but that doesn't mean we can't build something new. Something better, maybe. She looked around the living room, at the boxes waiting to be unpacked, at the space they were creating for their son, at the life they were constructing from hope and determination, and the shared commitment to being better than their fears. Something better. she repeated thoughtfully. I like the sound of that. The pediatrician's waiting room was filled with the controlled chaos of parents managing small children, but Dorian felt surprisingly calm as he bounced Gabriel gently in his arms. 2 months of fatherhood had given him confidence he'd never expected to develop. The ability to soothe a fussy baby, interpret different types of cries, and navigate the practical realities of caring for someone so completely dependent. Gabriel Marlowe Harlow? The nurse called, and Dorian stood adjusting the diaper bag on his shoulder with practiced ease. Dr. Sarah Chen's office was warm and welcoming, decorated with cheerful animals and equipped with the kind of gentle lighting that seemed designed to keep both babies and parents calm. Dorian had met Dr. Chen briefly during Gabriel's first checkup, but this was his first appointment flying solo. How's our little guy doing, Doctor? Chen asked, washing her hands thoroughly before approaching. And how's Dad handling single-parent duty today? Better than I expected, Dorian replied honestly. Sienna's at a job interview, so it's just us men today. Excellent. Let's see how Gabriel's growing. The next 20 minutes were a revelation in how much Dorian had absorbed about his son's development. He could answer Dr. A. Chen's questions about Gabriel's sleep patterns, feeding schedule, and the small milestones he'd been reaching. When Gabriel fussed during the examination, Dorian instinctively knew how to position him for comfort, how to use his voice to provide reassurance. He's developing beautifully, Dr. Chen said as she finished the examination. Weight gain is excellent, reflexes are strong, and his social responsiveness is right on track. She paused, making notes in Gabriel's chart. How are things at home? Is he sleeping through the night yet? Not quite, but he's down to 1 or 2 wake-ups, Dorian replied. Usually around 2 and 5 a.m. And you're helping with those night feedings? I take the 2 a.m. shift so Sienna can get longer stretches of sleep, Dorian said. We've found a routine that works for both of us. Dr. Chen's expression warmed with approval. That kind of partnership makes a huge difference for new mothers. And for babies, honestly. Gabriel's lucky to have 2 actively involved parents. The comment hit Dorian harder than expected. 6 months ago, he'd convinced himself that Gabriel would be better off without his involvement, that his complicated world would only create problems for his son. Now, holding Gabriel after his checkup, listening to a medical professional affirm that his presence made a positive difference, Dorian felt a deep sense of rightness about the choices they'd made. There is one thing I wanted to discuss, Dr. Chen continued. Gabriel's been exclusively breastfed so far, which is wonderful. But around 4 to 6 months, you'll want to start thinking about introducing some bottle feeding. Even if Sienna continues nursing, it gives babies practice with different feeding methods and gives mothers more flexibility. What would that look like? Dorian asked, genuinely curious. Sienna could pump milk, and you could handle some of the feedings. Or you could introduce formula for 1 or 2 feeds per day. The key is making sure Gabriel doesn't develop a preference for only one feeding method. Dorian nodded, already thinking about how to bring this up with Sienna. She was fiercely committed to breastfeeding, viewing it as both nutrition and bonding time with Gabriel, but he could see how additional feeding options might give her more freedom, especially if she got the job she'd interviewed for that morning. I'll talk to Sienna about it, he said. Good. And Mr. Harlow? You're doing an excellent job. It's not always easy for fathers to feel confident with medical appointments and developmental discussions, but you're clearly very tuned in to Gabriel's needs. As they left the pediatrician's office, Dorian felt a surge of paternal pride that was becoming familiar but never lost its power. Gabriel was healthy, developing well, and apparently benefiting from having 2 parents who were learning to work together despite their complicated history. His phone buzzed as he was strapping Gabriel into his car seat. A text from Sienna. Interview went well. How did checkup go? Dorian smiled as he typed back, perfect bill of health. Tell you everything when you get home. Home. The word had slipped out naturally, and Dorian realized he'd started thinking of the duplex as home in a way that his luxury penthouse had never felt. It wasn't about the space itself, but about the life being lived within it, the routine of shared meals, the sound of Gabriel's cries in the middle of the night, the comfortable rhythm of co-parenting that had developed between him and Sienna. The drive back to Park Slope gave Dorian time to think about Dr. Chen's suggestions regarding feeding, but also about the larger patterns that were emerging in their family life. They'd found a balance that worked, but it was delicate, requiring constant communication and adjustment. When they arrived home, Sienna's car was already in the driveway. Dorian found her in the kitchen, still dressed in her interview clothes, a navy blue dress that made her look both professional and beautiful, but she'd kicked off her heels and was barefoot, which somehow made the scene more intimate. "How's my favorite baby?" she asked immediately, reaching for Gabriel as Dorian entered. "Your favorite baby is perfect," Dorian replied, transferring Gabriel to her arms and watching the immediate relaxation that came over both mother and son. 13 pounds 2 ounces. Dr. Chen says his development is textbook perfect. "And how was it? Managing everything by yourself?" "Easier than I thought it would be," Dorian said honestly, "though I'm starting to understand why people talk about needing eyes in the back of their heads. He's getting more active." Sienna settled into the kitchen chair, immediately falling into the gentle bouncing motion that seemed to be automatic for mothers. Gabriel gazed up at her with the focused attention he reserved for the person who fed him most regularly. "Tell me about the interview," Dorian said, pouring himself a glass of water and leaning against the counter. "Really well, I think," Sienna replied, her voice carrying genuine excitement. "They want someone with crisis intervention experience, which is exactly what I've been doing. And the flexibility they offer is real. 2 days working from home, flexible hours for family emergencies, excellent family health coverage. That sounds perfect for what you need." It really does. They're making a decision by Friday, but the interview felt right. Like they understood that being a good employee and being a good mother aren't mutually exclusive. Dorian felt a complex mixture of pride and relief. Sienna deserved to have professional fulfillment alongside motherhood, and finding an employer who recognized her value while accommodating her family responsibilities felt like a major victory. "There's something else," Sienna continued, her tone shifting slightly. "They asked about childcare arrangements, whether I had reliable backup for when the work-from-home days weren't enough." "What did you tell them?" "That Gabriel's father is actively involved and available for childcare when needed." She looked up at Dorian with an expression that was part gratitude, part challenge. "I told them you were a true partner in parenting, not just someone who helps out occasionally." "Because I am," Dorian said simply. "I know that now," Sienna replied, but saying it out loud to strangers made it feel more official somehow, like we're really doing this. Gabriel made a small sound and reached toward Dorian, a gesture that was becoming more frequent as his vision improved and his recognition of faces became more sophisticated. Without thinking, Dorian reached back, letting Gabriel grasp his finger with surprising strength. "Dr. Chen mentioned something about introducing bottles," Dorian said. "Not to replace nursing, but to give Gabriel experience with different feeding methods, and to give you more flexibility." Sienna was quiet for a moment, considering. "I've been thinking about that too, actually, especially if I get this job. I won't be able to nurse during the day when I'm at the office. We could try it gradually," Dorian suggested. "Maybe I could handle 1 feeding per day with pumped milk or formula. See how Gabriel adapts." "You want to do feedings?" "I want to do everything," Dorian said with conviction. "Every part of taking care of him that I'm capable of doing. I want to be the kind of father who knows how to handle any situation that comes up." Sienna looked at him with an expression that had become familiar over the past few weeks. Surprise mixed with growing trust, as if she was still adjusting to this version of Dorian who prioritized fatherhood over everything else. "Okay," she said finally. "We'll try bottles, starting this weekend." "Really?" "Really. But you're in charge of teaching him how to use them. I have a feeling he's going to be just as stubborn about change as both of his parents." Dorian laughed, looking down at Gabriel, who was still gripping his finger with determined strength. "Then he'll fit right into this family." The first signs of trouble came on a Tuesday morning in early April, when Gabriel was just over 3 months old. Sienna had been at her new job for 2 weeks, and their routine had settled into something that felt sustainable. Dorian working from his downstairs office while Gabriel napped, Sienna handling client calls from the upstairs nursery on her work-from-home days, and both of them tag-teaming the night feedings with a efficiency that surprised them both. Dorian was in the middle of a video conference with his board of directors when he heard Gabriel crying upstairs, not the usual hungry or tired cry, but something more distressed. He muted his microphone and listened, waiting for the sound to stop as Sienna soothed him. Instead, the crying intensified. "I need to step away for a moment," Dorian told the board, not waiting for their response before ending the call and taking the stairs 2 at a time. He found Sienna in the nursery, holding Gabriel against her chest while tears streamed down her face. Gabriel's cries were different than anything Dorian had heard before, higher pitched, more urgent, and accompanied by a rigidity in his small body that set off every parental alarm bell. "He won't stop crying," Sienna said, her voice thick with panic. He won't nurse. He won't take a bottle. He feels warm but not feverish. Something's wrong, Dorian. Something's really wrong. Dorian moved to them immediately, placing a gentle hand on Gabriel's back. The baby's skin felt warm, and his usual responsiveness to familiar voices was completely absent. "How long has he been like this?" Dorian asked, keeping his voice calm despite the fear rising in his chest. 20 minutes, maybe longer. He woke up from his nap crying, and he hasn't stopped since. Sienna's hands were shaking as she tried to position Gabriel differently. "I've tried everything, feeding, changing, singing, walking. Nothing works." Dorian looked at his son at the way Gabriel's face was flushed and his breathing seemed slightly labored, and made a decision. "We're taking him to the emergency room," he said, already moving toward the door. "Do you think is it that serious?" Sienna asked, but she was already following him, grabbing the diaper bag and Gabriel's pediatrician information. "I don't know," Dorian replied honestly. "But when a 3-month-old baby cries like that and nothing helps, I'm not taking any chances." The drive to Brooklyn Methodist Hospital was the longest 15 minutes of Dorian's life. He focused on the road while Sienna sat in the back seat with Gabriel, her voice a steady stream of reassurances that she clearly didn't believe herself. Gabriel's cries had subsided to a weak whimpering that somehow seemed worse than the full-volume screaming. "It's okay, baby," Sienna murmured, her own voice breaking. "We're going to get you help. You're going to be fine." Dorian called Dr. Chen's office from the car, explaining the situation and getting instructions to head directly to the emergency room. He also sent a quick text to his assistant, canceling the rest of his meetings for the day. Everything else could wait. The pediatric emergency room was designed to be comforting, with soft colors and child-friendly decorations, but nothing could ease the anxiety Dorian felt as they checked in. Gabriel had fallen into an unsettling quiet, no longer crying but also not responding to familiar voices or faces. Gabriel Marlowe Harlow, the triage nurse, called after what felt like hours but had probably been 20 minutes. The examining room was small but well-equipped, and the emergency physician, Dr. Rodriguez, had the kind of calm competence that immediately made Dorian feel slightly less panicked. "Tell me what's been happening," Dr. Rodriguez said, washing her hands while Sienna described Gabriel's symptoms. "The crying started about an hour ago," Sienna explained, her voice steadier now but still tight with worry. "It wasn't his normal cry. It was more intense, and nothing would comfort him. He feels warm, but I didn't think he had a fever. He won't eat, won't respond to us normally." Dr. Rodriguez nodded, approaching Gabriel with gentle movements. "Let's take a look at this little guy." The examination was thorough but efficient. Temperature check, listening to his heart and lungs, examining his ears and throat, checking his reflexes and responsiveness. Gabriel tolerated it all with unusual passivity, which concerned Dorian almost as much as the earlier crying. "His temperature is slightly elevated, 100.2, Dr. Rodriguez reported. "Not dangerously high, but enough to make him uncomfortable. Let me check his ears again." She used a special otoscope, peering into Gabriel's ears with careful attention. When she straightened up, her expression was both relieved and sympathetic. "There's the culprit," she said. "Gabriel has an ear infection. Both ears, actually, which explains why he was so inconsolable. Ear infections are incredibly painful for babies, and they can't tell us what's wrong except through crying." "An ear infection," Sienna repeated, sinking into the chair beside the examining table. That's manageable, right?" "Absolutely manageable," Dr. Rodriguez assured her. "Very common in babies Gabriel's age. We'll prescribe antibiotics, and he should start feeling better within 24 to 48 hours. In the meantime, infant acetaminophen for pain relief and lots of comfort and patience." Dorian felt the tension in his shoulders released for the first time since Gabriel's crying had started. An ear infection was scary when you didn't know what was wrong, but it was treatable, temporary, something they could handle. "Will this affect his hearing?" Dorian asked, thinking about all the developmental milestones Dr. Chen had discussed. "Not if we treat it promptly, which we are," Dr. Rodriguez replied. "Some babies are prone to ear infections, so you'll want to watch for similar symptoms in the future, but this shouldn't have any lasting effects." As they left the hospital with prescriptions and instructions, Gabriel seemed marginally more comfortable in Sienna's arms. The worst was over, but Dorian could see the exhaustion in Sienna's face, the emotional toll of those terrifying hours when they didn't know what was wrong with their son. "You okay?" he asked as they settled Gabriel into his car seat. "Now I am," Sienna replied. "But for a while there I thought—" She stopped, shaking her head. "I've never been that scared in my life." "Neither have I," Dorian admitted. When I heard him crying like that when nothing we did helped, I felt completely helpless. But you didn't act helpless, Sienna said, buckling her seatbelt. You made the decision to go to the hospital. You handled everything calmly. You were exactly what Gabriel needed you to be. The drive home was quiet, Gabriel sleeping peacefully for the first time in hours. Dorian found himself thinking about how quickly everything had changed. From a normal Tuesday morning to a medical emergency that could have been serious, then back to manageable reality. There's going to be more of this, isn't there? Sienna said quietly, echoing his thoughts. More scares, more situations where we don't know what's wrong or what to do. Probably, Dorian replied, but we'll figure it out. Together. I called in sick to work, Sienna said. First week on the job and I'm already taking emergency time off. They'll understand. And if they don't, they're not the right employer for a working mother. When they got home, Dorian carried the sleeping Gabriel upstairs, while Sienna gathered the medications and prepared for what would likely be a difficult few days of recovery. As he placed his son gently in the crib, Dorian felt a surge of protective love so fierce it took his breath away. I'm sorry you hurt, little guy, he whispered. But we're going to take good care of you until you feel better. Downstairs, he found Sienna in the kitchen, staring at the prescription bottles with an expression of lingering worry. Hey, he said, putting his arms around her from behind. It was the first time he'd initiated physical contact since they'd moved into the duplex, but it felt natural, necessary after what they'd been through together. To his relief, she leaned back against him instead of pulling away. That was terrifying, she said quietly. It was, but we handled it. Gabriel's going to be fine and we know what to do if it happens again. I keep thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't been here, Sienna said. If I'd been alone when he got sick like that. But you weren't alone, Dorian replied. And you won't be. That's why we're doing this, so Gabriel always has both of us, whatever happens. She turned in his arms so she was facing him, and for a moment they stood there in their kitchen holding each other while their son slept peacefully upstairs. It felt like a moment of recognition, not just of their feelings for each other, but of what they'd built together, what they'd become as partners in the most important job either of them had ever taken on. Thank you, Sienna said softly, for being here, for taking charge when I was too scared to think clearly, for making Gabriel your priority. Thank you for trusting me too, Dorian replied and meant it more than any words he'd ever spoken. The call came at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday in late April, jolting Dorian awake from the deep sleep that had finally become possible now that Gabriel was sleeping through most nights. His phone buzzed insistently on the nightstand, and he fumbled for it in the darkness, his heart immediately racing with parental anxiety. Mr. Harlow? The voice was unfamiliar. Professional. This is Detective Morrison with the NYPD. I'm calling about Sienna Marlowe. The world stopped. Dorian sat up in bed, instantly alert, his mind jumping to the worst possible scenarios. Car accident, mugging, something terrible that happened to women alone in the city. What's happened? Is she hurt? She's fine, sir, Detective Morrison said quickly. But she's been involved in an incident. She was working late at her office when someone broke in. She's shaken up but uninjured. Dorian was already out of bed reaching for clothes. Where is she now? Community Family Support Services on West 34th Street. She specifically asked us to call you. Said you were her emergency contact and that you'd need to know because of your son, Gabriel. Of course, Sienna's first thought would be about Gabriel, about making sure he was safe and cared for while she dealt with whatever had happened. I'll be right there, Dorian said, already moving toward the door that connected his apartment to the upstairs unit. Gabriel was sleeping peacefully in his crib, completely unaware that anything had disrupted the quiet routine of their evening. Dorian stood over him for a moment, torn between the need to get to Sienna and the impossibility of leaving their son alone. His phone rang again. Catherine. I heard, his sister said without preamble. Detective Morrison called looking for your emergency contact information. I'm 15 minutes away. Catherine, you don't have to. Of course I do, she interrupted. Sienna needs you and Gabriel needs someone here. I'm already in the car. The relief Dorian felt was overwhelming. Having family who understood, who stepped up without being asked, made him realize how much their support system had grown over the past few months. 25 minutes later, Catherine was settled in the upstairs living room with Gabriel's monitor and a cup of coffee, and Dorian was driving through the nearly empty streets of Manhattan toward Sienna's office building. He found her sitting in the lobby, wrapped in a police-issued blanket despite the warm spring night. Her face was pale but composed, and she was answering questions for a young police officer with the kind of professional calm that spoke to her experience in crisis situations. When she saw Dorian, her composure cracked slightly and he could see the fear she'd been holding back. "Hey," he said, sitting beside her and immediately pulling her into his arms. "I'm here. You're okay." "I know," she said against his chest, but her voice was shaky. "I know I'm okay, it's just—" "Ma'am, if you're ready to continue," the police officer interrupted gently. "This is Gabriel's father," Sienna explained. "My co-parent. He can hear whatever you need to ask." The story that emerged was both frightening and mundane. Someone had broken into the office building after hours, apparently looking for computers or other valuable equipment. Sienna had been staying late to finish case files, working in her cubicle with headphones on, when she heard sounds from another part of the office. "I called 911 immediately," she explained. "I didn't try to investigate or confront anyone. I just hid in the bathroom until the police arrived." "Smart thinking," Detective Morrison said. "The perpetrator was gone by the time we arrived, but we found signs of forced entry and some missing equipment. Nothing from your immediate work area, though." "Were you hurt at all?" Dorian asked, though he'd been told she was fine. "No, just scared. Really scared." Sienna looked up at him. "The whole time I was hiding, all I could think about was Gabriel, about what would happen to him if something happened to me." The words hit Dorian hard, reminding him of how much responsibility Sienna carried, how aware she was of her role as Gabriel's primary caretaker. It also made him realize how much their arrangement meant to her, knowing that Gabriel had another parent who would step in without question. "Nothing happened to you," Dorian said firmly. "You're safe, Gabriel's safe, and you made all the right choices." After finishing with the police and arranging for additional security at the office building, they drove home through the quiet pre-dawn streets. Sienna was silent for most of the trip, staring out the window at the city that suddenly felt less safe than it had 12 hours earlier. "I keep thinking I should feel more upset," she said as they pulled into their driveway. "It was scary, but it's over. No one was hurt. Nothing really happened." "Something did happen," Dorian replied, turning off the engine. "You were in a potentially dangerous situation alone, and that's frightening no matter how well you handled it." "I couldn't stop thinking about what would happen to Gabriel if something had happened to me," she repeated. "I mean, I know he'd be okay with you, but the idea of him growing up without his mother—" "Hey," Dorian said, reaching across the car to take her hand. "Nothing happened to you. You're here. You're safe. And Gabriel is going to wake up in the morning with both his parents exactly where they should be." Inside, Catherine was reading a book in the living room, the baby monitor beside her showing Gabriel's peaceful sleep. "Everything okay?" she asked quietly. "Fine," Dorian replied. "Thank you for staying. I owe you." "You don't owe me anything," Catherine said, gathering her things. "That's what family does." She hugged Sienna gently. "I'm glad you're okay. And if you need anything over the next few days, someone to watch Gabriel, help with errands, anything, just call." After Catherine left, Dorian and Sienna stood in their kitchen, the familiar space feeling somehow different after the night's events. The routine of home, the coffee maker ready for morning, Gabriel's bottles lined up in the refrigerator, the domestic order they'd created together, felt precious in a way it hadn't hours earlier. "I should try to get some sleep," Sienna said, but she made no move toward the stairs. "Are you going to be able to sleep?" Dorian asked. "I don't know. Every time I close my eyes, I keep hearing those sounds in the office, wondering what would have happened if—" "Don't," Dorian said gently. "Don't go down that path. You're safe, you made smart choices, and it's over." "I know. Logically, I know that." She sank into one of the kitchen chairs. "But I can't seem to turn off my brain." Dorian considered for a moment, then made a decision. "Stay down here tonight, on the couch, I mean. I'll stay too. That way you won't be alone if you can't sleep." "You don't have to do that." "I want to," Dorian said simply. "I don't think either of us should be alone tonight." He made them both tea while Sienna changed into comfortable clothes, and they settled into the living room with blankets and pillows from the linen closet. It was the first time they'd shared sleeping space since Gabriel was born, but it felt natural rather than awkward. Two people who cared about each other providing comfort after a frightening experience. "Dorian," Sienna said quietly from the couch across from his chair, "thank you for coming tonight, for dropping everything and just being there. Where else would I be? 6 months ago, I wouldn't have known who to call," she said. "I would have handled it alone, gone home to an empty apartment and tried to convince myself I was fine." "You're not alone anymore," Dorian replied. "Whatever happens, Whatever you need, you're not alone. They talked quietly for another hour. About the break-in, about work safety protocols, about the strange vulnerability that came with being responsible for someone as helpless as Gabriel. Eventually, Sienna's breathing evened out, and she fell asleep curled up on the couch, looking younger and more peaceful than she had all evening. Dorian stayed awake longer, thinking about how quickly life could change, how precious the ordinary moments were that he'd once taken for granted. A few months ago, he'd convinced himself that his complicated world was too dangerous for a family. Tonight had shown him that danger existed everywhere, but what mattered was having people who would show up, who would care for each other when things went wrong. As dawn began to filter through the windows, Gabriel's soft cries came through the monitor. Dorian moved quietly upstairs to get him, bringing him down to the living room rather than waking Sienna. "Good morning, little man," he whispered, settling into the rocking chair with Gabriel and a bottle. "Mama had a scary night, so we're letting her sleep a little longer." Gabriel nursed contentedly, completely trusting that his needs would be met, that the adults in his life would keep him safe and comfortable. As Dorian watched the sun rise through their windows, holding his son while Sienna slept peacefully nearby, he felt a deep sense of gratitude for the family they'd built. Imperfect, unconventional, but real in all the ways that mattered. The crisis arrived on a perfect May morning when Gabriel was 4 months old, and their life had settled into a rhythm that felt almost too good to be true. Dorian was in his downstairs office, reviewing quarterly reports while Gabriel napped upstairs with Sienna, when his phone rang with a call that would change everything. "Dorian, we have a problem," his business partner James said without preamble. "A big one. We need you in Singapore. Today." "Today?" Dorian looked at his calendar, which was deliberately light to accommodate his new priorities. "James, I can't just—" "The Meridian deal is collapsing," James interrupted. 3 months of negotiations, $40 million in projected revenue, and their board is getting cold feet. They want to meet with you personally before they walk away completely. Dorian felt his stomach drop. The Meridian deal wasn't just another contract. It was the cornerstone of their expansion into Asian markets, a strategic move that would position their telecommunications company as a global player, rather than just a regional success. "Can't we handle this via video conference or send Thompson? They specifically requested you," James said. "Apparently, there are concerns about your level of commitment to the company. Some of the board members have heard rumors about your reduced involvement, and they're questioning whether we're still the stable partner they thought they were investing in." The irony was bitter. For months, Dorian had been working harder than ever, just differently, more efficiently, more focused, with clearer priorities about what deserved his attention. But in the business world, physical presence was often mistaken for commitment, and his choice to work from home more frequently had apparently been interpreted as a lack of dedication. "How long would I need to be gone?" Dorian asked, though he already knew the answer would be complicated. "A week minimum, maybe 2 if we need to rebuild relationships with other potential partners in the region." 2 weeks. Gabriel would change so much in 2 weeks at this stage of his development, and Sienna was just hitting her stride at her new job, finally feeling confident about the balance between work and motherhood. The timing couldn't be worse. "Let me call you back in an hour," Dorian said. "Dorian, we don't have an hour. The flight leaves in 6 hours, and if we miss this window—" "1 hour, James. I'll give you an answer in 1 hour." Dorian ended the call and sat in the quiet of his office, listening to the sounds of his family above him. Sienna was talking to Gabriel in the soft sing-song voice she used during tummy time, and Gabriel was making the happy gurgling sounds that had become Dorian's favorite soundtrack. This was the test he'd been unconsciously preparing for, the moment when his old life and his new priorities would collide in a way that demanded a clear choice. 6 months ago, he wouldn't have hesitated. The business would have taken precedence over everything else, and he would have been on that plane without a second thought. Now, the decision felt impossible. Upstairs, he found Sienna lying on the nursery floor beside Gabriel, who was pushing himself up during tummy time with the determined concentration he brought to every new skill. "Hey," she said, smiling up at Dorian. "Look how strong he's getting. Dr. Chen said some babies don't do this until 5 or 6 months. "He's amazing," Dorian agreed, settling onto the floor beside them. "Sienna, I need to talk to you about something." Something in his tone made her sit up, immediately alert. "What's wrong?" "Not wrong exactly, but complicated." He explained the situation with Meridian, the ultimatum from James, the implications for his company if he didn't go. Sienna listened without interrupting, her expression growing more thoughtful as he spoke. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, watching Gabriel push himself up with increasing confidence. "What do you want to do?" she asked finally. "I want to stay here," Dorian said without hesitation. "I want to be here for Gabriel's milestones and your work presentations and the ordinary Tuesday afternoons that make up real life, but this is your company," Sienna finished. "The thing you've spent years building." "Yes. And if you don't go, you could lose something that represents decades of work and affects a lot of people's livelihoods." "Potentially, yes." Gabriel rolled from his tummy onto his back, a new skill he'd just mastered, and immediately began reaching for the colorful mobile hanging above him. Both parents automatically smiled at his accomplishment, the conversation pausing as they celebrated this tiny but significant moment. "I have an idea," Sienna said slowly. "What if we went with you? To Singapore?" Dorian's voice was incredulous. "Sienna, Gabriel's only 4 months old and you just started your new job. My job has flexibility for family emergencies and this qualifies. As for Gabriel, babies travel all the time. It might be good for him to experience new places. It would be a business trip, not a vacation. I'd be in meetings most of the time, dealing with difficult people and complex negotiations. Then I'd be there to take care of Gabriel so you could focus on saving your deal," Sienna said practically. "And in the evenings, when you're free, we could explore the city together. As a family." The word hung in the air between them. Family. Not co-parents or housemates or people figuring things out, but a family that traveled together, supported each other's professional goals, and faced challenges as a unit. "Are you sure?" Dorian asked. "It would be exhausting and stressful and—" "Dorian," Sienna interrupted gently. "3 months ago I thought I'd be raising Gabriel alone. Now I'm talking about flying halfway around the world to support your business trip. That's not a sacrifice. That's what families do. Even if we haven't figured out what we are to each other." Sienna looked down at Gabriel, who was now grasping the edge of his playmat with fierce determination, trying to pull himself toward a toy that was just out of reach. "I think we have figured it out," she said quietly. "Maybe not the romantic part, maybe not the traditional definitions, but we're Gabriel's parents. We're partners in the most important job either of us will ever have, and we care about each other's success and happiness." "Is that enough?" Dorian asked. "For now," Sienna replied, meeting his eyes. "For now, it's everything." 2 hours later, Dorian called James back with his answer. Yes, he would go to Singapore. Yes, he would save the Meridian deal, but he wouldn't be going alone. "You're bringing your family?" James sounded confused. "Dorian, this isn't a pleasure trip. We're trying to convince these people that you're serious about business." "I am serious about business," Dorian replied. "I'm also serious about being a father and a partner. The people I want to work with will understand that those things aren't mutually exclusive." The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. Passport checks, flight arrangements, frantic packing of baby supplies and business suits. Sienna called her supervisor to explain the situation, and to Dorian's relief, her manager was not only understanding, but impressed that she was willing to support her family while maintaining her professional responsibilities. "You'll have access to email and can handle any urgent cases remotely," her supervisor said. "Take the time you need." As they stood in the airport that evening, Gabriel sleeping peacefully in his carrier while departure announcements echoed around them, Dorian felt a profound shift in his understanding of what success actually meant. 6 months ago, success had been about individual achievement, about building something that would outlast him, about proving himself in increasingly competitive arenas. Tonight, success looked like Sienna adjusting Gabriel's blanket while reviewing his travel documents, like having a family that chose to support each other, even when it was inconvenient, like being trusted with the most important things in someone else's life. "Flight 847 to Singapore now boarding," the gate agent announced. "Ready?" Sienna asked, shouldering the diaper bag while Dorian managed their carry-on luggage. "With you two?" "I'm ready for anything," Dorian replied. As they walked toward the gate, Gabriel stirring slightly in his carrier but remaining peacefully asleep, Dorian realized that this moment, this choice to prioritize family while still pursuing professional goals, wasn't a compromise. It was the first truly adult decision he'd ever made. The old Dorian would have seen Singapore as a test of his business acumen. The new Dorian saw it as something much more important, the first family adventure, the beginning of a life where love and ambition could coexist, where success was measured not just by what you achieved, but by who stood beside you while you achieved it. "Thank you," he said to Sienna as they settled into their seats, "for coming with me, for believing that we can make this work." "Thank you for choosing us," she replied, adjusting Gabriel in her arms as the plane prepared for takeoff. And as they lifted off into the night sky, heading toward an uncertain future in a foreign country, Dorian felt more grounded than he ever had in his life. 18 months later, the Christmas morning sun streamed through the windows of their Park Slope duplex, illuminating a living room that had been thoroughly ransacked by an almost 2-year-old who possessed both his father's determination and his mother's intelligence. Gabriel stood at the coffee table, carefully placing wooden blocks in precarious towers before gleefully knocking them down, a game that had entertained him for the better part of an hour. "Dada! Look!" Gabriel called out, his vocabulary having exploded over the past few months into a constant stream of observations, questions, and demands for attention. "I see, buddy," Dorian replied from the kitchen where he was attempting to coordinate Christmas breakfast while Sienna finished getting ready upstairs. Very impressive engineering work. The past year and a half had transformed everything about their lives, but gradually, naturally, in ways that felt like evolution rather than revolution. Singapore had been the turning point, not just because Dorian had successfully saved the Meridian deal, but because they'd proven to themselves that they could function as a family unit even under pressure. The business trip had stretched to 3 weeks, during which Gabriel had charmed every business associate Dorian introduced him to. Sienna had worked remotely while exploring Singapore's family-friendly attractions, and all three of them had fallen into routines that accommodated both professional responsibilities and family needs. "Mama," Gabriel announced as Sienna appeared on the stairs, wearing a red sweater that brought out the warmth in her brown hair and made her blue eyes even more striking. "Good morning, my love," she said, scooping Gabriel up for the morning cuddles that had become sacred in their household. "Merry Christmas." "Merry Christmas," Gabriel attempted, his version of the holiday greeting that had been getting clearer every day. Dorian watched them together, still amazed by how natural motherhood looked on Sienna, how Gabriel's personality had emerged as a perfect blend of both his parents, curious and determined like Dorian, compassionate and intuitive like Sienna. "Coffee?" Dorian offered, holding up a mug. "Please," Sienna replied, settling onto the couch with Gabriel while he immediately began his morning exploration of everything within reach. Their morning routine had evolved over the months into something that felt both comfortable and intentional. Dorian handled breakfast preparation while Sienna managed Gabriel's complex morning needs. Then they'd switch off depending on who had more pressing work obligations that day. "Your mother called earlier," Sienna said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "She wanted to make sure we knew to bring Gabriel's new winter coat to dinner tonight." Christmas dinner at the Harlow estate had become a tradition that everyone looked forward to, especially Eleanor, who had embraced her role as grandmother with the same elegance and warmth she brought to everything else. "She's been shopping for him again, hasn't she?" Dorian asked with amusement. 3 new outfits, a set of educational toys, and apparently a rocking horse that's being delivered this afternoon," Sienna replied with a shake of her head. "Your son is going to be completely spoiled." "Our son," Dorian corrected automatically, a habit that had developed somewhere around Gabriel's first birthday when the distinction between his child and their child had finally disappeared completely. "Our son," Sienna agreed with a smile that held layers of meaning Dorian was still learning to interpret. The relationship between them had evolved too, though more slowly and carefully than their partnership as parents. They'd moved through the seasons of Gabriel's first year as friends, then close friends, then something deeper that they hadn't quite named but both recognized. There had been moments, hands brushing while passing Gabriel between them, conversations that ran late into the night after he was asleep, shared laughter over Gabriel's latest developmental milestone that felt like courtship, but a courtship built on foundation rather than fantasy. "I have something for you," Dorian said, retrieving a wrapped package from behind the coffee maker. "Dorian, we agreed no gifts this year," Sienna protested, though she was already reaching for the present with obvious curiosity. "This isn't a gift exactly. It's more of a question." Sienna paused, looking up at him with an expression that was suddenly very alert. "What kind of question?" "Open it first." Gabriel, sensing something important was happening, crawled over to Sienna and pulled himself up on her legs, wanting to be part of whatever was occurring. Inside the box was a small velvet jewelry case, but not the kind that typically held engagement rings. Instead, when Sienna opened it, she found a simple gold pendant, a compass with 3 initial letters engraved around the points, S, D, and G. "It's beautiful," she said softly, lifting the necklace from its case. "What does it mean?" It means that no matter where we go, Singapore, or anywhere else life takes us, we'll always find our way back to each other, Dorian said. All three of us. Dorian, I'm not proposing, he said quickly, seeing the wariness that flickered across her face. I'm not asking for more than what we have. I just wanted you to know that what we have is everything to me. You and Gabriel are my true north. You always will be, whether we stay exactly as we are or whether we decide someday to try for something more traditional. Sienna was quiet for a long moment, studying the compass pendant, then looking at Gabriel, who was babbling happily while pulling himself up on the couch. Help me put it on, she asked finally, as Dorian fastened the necklace around her neck, his fingers brushing her skin. He felt the same electric connection that had always existed between them, but tempered now with patience and certainty about what really mattered. I love you, Sienna said quietly, the words slipping out so naturally that it took a moment for their significance to register. I love you too, Dorian replied, and realized they were the first time either of them had said it since Gabriel was born. Woof, Gabriel announced loudly, clapping his hands as if he understood exactly what had just happened. They both laughed, the seriousness of the moment dissolving into the kind of joy that had become their family's signature, deep feeling expressed through lightness, love that was strong enough to include humor and everyday chaos. So what happens now? Sienna asked, adjusting Gabriel in her lap while he reached for her new necklace. Now we have Christmas breakfast, Dorian said practically. Then we go to my parents' house, where Gabriel will be thoroughly spoiled by his grandmother. Tonight we come home, put him to bed and figure out what our family looks like going forward. And if we can't figure it out, then we keep doing what we've been doing, Dorian replied, taking it one day at a time, putting Gabriel first and trusting that love is enough to build on. Gabriel chose that moment to escape from Sienna's lap and toddle across the room to his toy box, his walking still unsteady but determined. He pulled out his favorite stuffed elephant and brought it back to share, dropping it in Dorian's lap with the generosity that defined his personality. Ellie for Dada, Gabriel announced seriously. Thank you, buddy, Dorian said, accepting the stuffed animal with the gravity such offerings deserved. That's very thoughtful. As Gabriel settled between them on the couch, clutching his second favorite toy while Ellie remained with Dorian, Sienna reached across their son to take Dorian's hand. Merry Christmas, she said softly. Merry Christmas, Dorian replied, squeezing her fingers gently. Outside, snow was beginning to fall, the kind of gentle Christmas morning snow that made everything look peaceful and magical. Inside their duplex, surrounded by the comfortable chaos of toys and family and the promise of a day filled with people who loved them, Dorian felt the deep contentment that came from finally understanding what home actually meant. It wasn't a place or a plan or a perfect arrangement. It was this: Gabriel's sleepy weight against his side, Sienna's hand in his, and the quiet knowledge that they'd built something together that was strong enough to weather whatever came next. Ready for breakfast? Sienna asked as Gabriel began to show signs of hunger-induced crankiness. Ready for everything, Dorian replied, and meant it completely. As they moved into the kitchen together, Gabriel toddling between them while chattering in his developing language about Christmas and breakfast and Ellie, Dorian reflected on how much had changed since that Christmas Eve phone call 18 months earlier. He'd thought he was racing to the hospital to witness the end of something, the final closure of a relationship he'd destroyed through his own fear. Instead, he'd arrived at the beginning of everything that actually mattered: fatherhood, partnership, and love that was strong enough to be rebuilt from honesty rather than built on fantasy. The fire between them had never really been hidden, he realized. It had just been waiting for both of them to become brave enough to tend it properly, to feed it with daily choices and small sacrifices, and the kind of commitment that grew stronger under pressure rather than weaker. Now, watching Sienna help Gabriel into his high chair while humming Christmas carols, Dorian knew they'd found their way to something better than what they'd lost. Not just a relationship, but a family that had been forged through crisis and strengthened through choice. And as Gabriel banged his spoon against his tray in rhythmic celebration of Christmas morning, Dorian smiled, knowing that this was exactly where all three of them belonged. What do you think about second chances and building love on a foundation of friendship and shared responsibility? Have you ever experienced a relationship that became stronger after being rebuilt rather than simply restored? Your participation means a lot to the channel. Please share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment below letting us know what you thought. Your feedback and support mean a lot to us. Stay tuned for more exciting stories.